We spend so much time trying to fix our minds, and then we go right back into the same woes, the same conversations, the same patterns that almost drained us. So here's a question to sit with. Why not let your anxiety not only inside of you, but also between you and your environment? And today we are talking about what it really takes to build a balanced mind through balanced relationships and a healthier emotional ecosystem. Welcome back to another episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, where we keep mental health practical, human, and doable. I'm your host, Sayan, as some of you would know, and today I'm joined by David Marcus. He has a PhD, and he is a clinical psychologist with decades of experience in therapy, research, and supporting families under stress. So, our topic for today's conversation is rather really simple but hard to live, which is a balanced mind needs balanced relationships and a balanced environment. And by the end of this conversation, you will be walking away with a clearer language and picture for what's happening in your relationships and a few grounded ways on how you can shift yourself without blaming yourself for everything. So, Dr. David, it's a pleasure to have you here with me today, and I'm excited to see where this conversation flows.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, David, it's an exciting, opportunity for all of us to, get to talk about that perspective in depth. So before we kind of go into the frameworks and, the kind of mindset that is required, to start with, before we go into all of that, when you hear the phrase balanced mind, what do you notice when people usually think it means versus what it actually is in real life?
Well, actually, you sort of hit the nail on the head in your introduction. You can't have a balanced mind without a balanced life, okay? Because there's too many things. I call them impingements, okay? Things that impinge upon your well-being. And they can be many, many things. Now, in its simplest form, a soothing presence is someone who's okay when you're not okay. When we think about the people that we turn to when we're upset or have some intense emotion, it's usually a friend or a family member, but invariably they are okay when we're not okay. Now, that's a very simple thing, but I use the phrase presence rather than person because of what you said earlier, because you can't be a soothing person without having an environment that's soothing. All right. Right. And that depends on your relationships and these impingements from the outside. Impingements, for instance, like job stress or financial problems, or you don't get along with your partner, or, there's many, many things that can get in the way of it. All right. And with your kids, the same thing, only you have to help the children to develop the capacity to have a soothing presence in their life so they can soothe themselves. And that's part of well-being. All right. Now that's a skill. That's not something that just happens.
Hmm.
But how do you achieve that is what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. So, any kind of problem that you have in your life, and I like to break it down into three steps. So, it's what I call the what, why, and how. So, what is when you look at it and, okay, you ask yourself, what is that you're exactly feeling or going through? And the second is why aspect of it, right? Why? Understanding the why, gives you a broader depth of the what instance. But like you said, the how aspect is something that eventually we would be digging deeper into towards the end of this conversation. But, I really appreciate that, David, because I think it really pulls us away from the perfectly calm nature of a person and, pulls us towards something more realistic, which is steadiness, flexibility, and repair. So, I'm curious as to what do you think is a common misconception that people usually carry about mental balance? Especially the idea that if if I'm self-aware enough, I'll be fine. But what do you think usually goes wrong there?
Well, what happens is people try to use logic to deal with emotional situations. Why? Because it's easier and it's predictable. But I'm here to tell you, after 40 years of practice as a therapist with handling families under stress, I tell people when they come into my office, put your logical cap on my little glass table because it's not going to be logical what we're talking about. So this is where arguments sort of stick, yeah, I don't understand why you feel that way because that's not logical. Well, guess what? It isn't logical. I'm going to describe to your listeners what happens when people get really upset, and which of course disturbs what we're calling their well-being. You know, well, I describe it this way: we have an emotional space within us, right? And it's a psychological space. It's not a real one. And typically we point to our heart when we think about our emotions, but it's really, associations in our mind. We like to think of ourselves as very logical people. A leads to C, B leads to C, rather. But actually, most of the associations in our mind are emotional. Okay. We just don't like to think of that because if we admit that, we have to admit to our own inner chaos, and we don't want to admit to inner chaos. All right. So, in any case, what I want to describe to your listeners is what happens when we get filled up with an intense emotion, because that obviously gets in the way of our well-being and our balance and all the other things, and that we're referring to here. So what happens? Well, this space gets filled up. Now, what fills it up is obvious: intense emotion, anger, anxiety, fear, apprehension. In fact, in little children, it can be intense glee from getting a little toy. It's the intensity of the emotion that fills us up. And what people need to understand is what happens when we get filled up. Well, first of all, we know it. We know when we're filled up with intense emotion. We have phrases that describe it, which is like, I've had it up to here, or the straw that broke the camel's back. There's lots of ways to describe this. And so we're aware of it. So what do we do? Well, as human beings, we focus inwardly and try to do something about the intensity of how we feel. We may get it off our chest with somebody, a soothing presence. We may journal. We may go for a run to get rid of the energy. We may watch television and distract ourselves. Choose how you do it, basically. But what I'm trying to get at is this: when we're focused inwardly to deal with our intense emotions, by definition, we are not focused outwardly on what people are saying to us. What does that mean? It means that somebody can give us the calmest, most logical explanation for why we shouldn't feel that way or what to do about it. You don't hear it. You don't hear it. So, this is a problem, because you ever hear the phrase, a blinding rage? Blinding rage. Well, that's very descriptive. When somebody is that filled up with anger, they're almost blind to everything that's going on around them. So people try to talk logic and be calm and everything, and finally they just throw up their hands and say, I can't talk to you. It's like talking to a brick wall. That's another very common phrase. And it's true, because what is really necessary is that person needs to be emptied out before they can hear anything that you're going to say. Right? Now that's a skill. That's a skill. And here's where it's different than simply getting things off your chest, right? Or catharsis, as they say in, psychoanalytic talk. So what I have found is that there are 3 levels of emotional intensity that have to be emptied out if a person is going to be able to hear you. The first level is the obvious level, the here and now. Well, that's easy. That's where we have all the words. That's the logical part. And I usually use a simple example. It's your job. Please take out the garbage. Pretty common, right? And we have lots of words to describe them. Why you should take out the garbage. It's your job. The garbage man's coming tomorrow. It doesn't smell good. We have all these simple, logical reasons why we should take out the garbage. But the next deeper level of emotional intensity is the history level. This is the 6th time I've asked you to take out the garbage and you haven't done it. Right? Well, obviously, the person who's asking is going to be much more intense the sixth time than the first time. But if you were a stranger, an observer looking in and did not know that history, you might turn to that person and say, what's the big deal? So they didn't take out the garbage. Why are you getting so upset? The logic begins to break down.
Wow, I love that.
The deepest level is what I call the tapped into level. Now, this one can go pretty much anywhere, and sometimes people aren't even aware of where it is. But let's take this simple example. I've asked you to take out the garbage 6 times now, and you haven't done it. You don't listen to me. I hate when people don't listen to me. When I was a kid, my brother would pick on me, and I would tell my parents, and they wouldn't listen to me. They always believed my brother, and this one can go anywhere. Okay? So all 3 levels have, and actually the most intensity comes from that deepest level. You think about it, but that's it. So all 3 levels have to be emptied out. The first level is easy, the whole logic. The second level, you know you're emptying out somebody when they say things like, you never do this, or you always do that. Now they're referring to previous events. Or you can elicit it, say, has that happened before? Have I done that before? See? The deepest level is, what is it like when I do that? Notice I'm using a more therapeutic approach than simply asking a person, why do you feel that way? Or you shouldn't feel that way because it makes no sense. Because if you take responsibility for making somebody feel a certain way, even if you didn't mean to, even if it was because you tapped into something very difficult for them and you didn't know it, it's still an invitation for them to explain things to you without having to defend how they feel. If you just stick with the logic, they're going to have to defend how they really feel. You know who's really bad at this? I'll give you a little aside. Attorneys are really, really bad at this. Attorneys, you know. What? Why do you feel that way? Give me chapter and verse. Why? You know, give me examples. No, that's not a good example. Therefore, you shouldn't feel that way. I do anyway. I'm sorry, Dad. You know, that type of thing. And you know, it's like it works in court. Yeah, you have to prove everything in court, but it doesn't work in emotional relationships. So I see attorneys with their families, and it's funny almost because I know exactly what I'm going to hear. You know, you know, it's not adaptive. But in any case, how to do that is very key, because when you do that, what you're actually doing, the listener is mirroring back what they hear. They're not summarizing, they're not recapping it, they're not putting in their own 2 cents, and especially not going, oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean, this is what I do. You know, they don't give an answer, nothing like that, which is very typical of parents with their children, you know. But I'll put it to you this way before I go further. When you have something that's hard on your heart, for instance, and you turn to somebody and you begin to explain it to them, and they say, oh, wait a minute, I know just how you're feeling. I went through it, and this is what I did, and this is what you should do, and then you'll feel all better. You're already laughing all the time. You know? Well, if it's a good friend, my guess is you turn to them and say, just hear me out. Just hear me out. If it wasn't a good friend, you might say, thank you, and go find a good friend. You know what I mean? Because it's just not helpful. With children, you know, to develop this capacity with children, you're not expecting a 6-year-old to turn to their parents who just go into this. Oh, yeah, just do it. And say, hey, Mom, Dad, will you just be quiet and let me finish? No, they're 6. They're not going to do that. They're going to sit there and listen. And you think you've got it, you know, all solved and everything because they're quiet. And then 3 days later, something similar happens and they're just as upset as they were 3 days ago. I thought we talked about this. No, you didn't. You see? So this is a very essential part of well-being. People need a soothing presence. Their children need them to be a soothing presence if they're a parent. And this is actually a wonderful legacy, because if you can practice this and help your children to do this, they'll take that in as their way of dealing with intense emotions.
Hmm.
They'll be able to be a soothing presence for themselves and for their children, and they have children later on. Because one of the things that we get called internalization is a process that's almost like subliminal learning. It gets in there below our level of awareness. And one of those things that we pick up from our parents typically is how we react to stress. So if your parents get all bent out of shape or get angry or get aggressive even, or they just go into this, their own little lecture number 4, that's what you're going to pick up and that's how you're going to parent. And you're not going to be able to internalize this soothing presence so you can now soothe yourself. In children, that ability is called resilience. And when they grow up, you know what we call it then? Stress tolerance. Stress tolerance. And if you're going to have a balanced mind and sense of well-being and control everything, you can make your home as much of a haven and a soothing environment as you can. But there's always going to be outside things and their children are going to have outside things. You need to be able to do this for yourself, for your kids. So this is a very important part of family growth. You want to call it emotional intelligence, that's fine, but there's a process here. It's not just having that intelligence, you develop that intelligence. And we're talking about how that happens. So it's quite a process that we're talking about here.
Yeah, indeed, Dr. David. And I like the way that you particularly phrase the term, which is a soothing presence. And now, as we are deeper into this conversation, it does make a lot more sense than when I heard it the first time. So, before uh, I mean, you talked about something important, like people would just turn away and find a way of their own, like escape from the reality for a few seconds. Now I just want to ask you this because I'm curious, how healthy do you think escapism is really? When somebody's not able to find that soothing presence.
Okay. Let's take the second one first. Finding a soothing presence, right? Now, the hope is that you have friends and family that can do this for you. But let's say you don't.
Hmm.
Here's where you run into trouble. And here's what I'm going to talk about. Was how do we, what do we call chemistry? When people meet, there's chemistry. That actually means nothing if you think about it. What does that mean? But okay, how I'm using it is this. We're attracted to people when we can relate to them in the ways that we know how to relate, which typically comes from observing parents or other relationships. See what I mean?
Yeah.
That's not always the healthiest thing.
Yeah.
I'll give you
I get what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a real world example. I saw a 10-year-old boy and a 8-year-old girl many, many years ago. Their parents were divorced and they were always bickering and fighting. And the boy would take on the role of appeasing and placating, appeasing the parents. Why? Because he wanted to protect his sister from the intense feelings that were going on between his parents. Right?
Yeah.
Now I call that a role because it really is a role. It's a not me situation. He was not developing himself. He was falling into a role to keep his family together, keep things peace. I saw him 15, 16 years later. He's now grown. He calls me up. He wants to come in and see me. And he came in to see me. He was a successful young man. He had a good job. He was graduated college, but he was in a relationship with a very high maintenance woman, always demanding of him, learning more emotionally, anything, and he was feeling really depressed about it. Never could seem to please her. Well, I happen to have the notes from all those years ago, but everything's on the computer, you know. And I reviewed them, but I remember them. And we talked about, you know, you're playing the same role, this woman, as you did with your parents, the pleaser, the placater, you know. And he looked at me like, you're right. It's the same thing, isn't it, Dr. Parker? I went, yeah, it is. You know, it's something I call empty depression. You know, there's lots of words to describe depression, but empty depression is like, I'm feeling empty and that's making me depressed. Why? Because it was a role. It wasn't really him. But that's the best term I come up for it. You know, there was a gap in his experience of being himself. Well, he got out of that relationship, found a much more helpful relationship, got married, has a baby and a house now, you know, and it all, you know, just from, you talked about it for a while, you know, and he realized it more and more and letting him come to that conclusion and figure out what to do. And that worked, you know, why? Because he wasn't playing the role anymore and he wasn't depressed and he was happier because he was being himself.
Hmm.
So when you ask about, you have a soothing presence, hopefully the people that you end up with or in like a long-term relationship will be a soothing presence for you and you for them. You create what I call a haven, where the only way I've been able to describe this is somehow when you're together, you're better than the sum of your parts. Somehow it works. It's hard to define that. But if you're in one of these role-playing relationships, it's stormy, it doesn't work, it's very, very hard. Okay? So how do you find a soothing presence? You got to look for one, you know, because all of our soothing begins externally. When you're a baby, you get soothed, somebody holds you, they cuddle you, then you go to words and emotional language, you know, it develops. If you haven't developed it, it's very, you know, then you have to actually look for that in relationships, right? You actually have to look for that. And it may actually feel uncomfortable because you're not used to it. And I help couples learn to be a soothing presence for one another. And there's a lot to that. There's a lot to that. I don't know if we want to go into that, the couples therapy part of it, but it's very important that they realize what they're truly dealing with. If they're playing a role, if they're regressing back to these internalized responses that they learned early on, do they have the words to describe why they feel the way they do? You see how much there is to this? There really is a lot. So it's that's therapy. What can I tell you? That is not short term. That's not 4 sessions and you're all better kind of therapy. This is deep, insight oriented therapy with basically someone who understands the things that we're talking about now. Notice it's not counseling. Notice I'm not giving advice so much as helping them to realize what they're really dealing with. Now that's different than simply saying, oh, just do this and you'll feel a little better.
Yeah, I think it does indeed explains the whole process of again finding yourself amidst the chaos and be that soothing presence, like you said, for others. And Dr. David, I would say it's practical because it kind of gives a practical way to for the listeners who are listening to this right now to observe more without spiraling down, right? It's almost like building a relational weather report instead of self-blame. And I think that does comes back to full circle about how you should see yourself and observe the moments rather than complain everything about in one's life, which can then you could be that beacon for somebody else's life, and it's just a reciprocation from there. So if someone's listening to this right now and David wants to connect with you, as in learn, he or she wants to perhaps learn more about your work. Where's the best place for them to find you and stay connected? And also, if you would like, share a line about your forthcoming book as well, and who's it for?
Okay. The book is Parent RX, like Parent Prescription. That's all about parenting. There's a subtitle about parenting, your children well, right? Um, it's in process of being published. People want to get in touch with me. I have a website, parent prescription, parentrx.org is my website. And I've done a number of podcasts talking about this and other topics, and they're welcome to do that. Also, I have a email address if people wanted to consult with me. Okay. And that is dsmarcus, DSMARCUS, PhD. I'll repeat that, dsmarcus, PhD, at parentrx.org. And then they can contact. And the book actually gives the verbiage. I give examples. Parent says, child says, parent says, child says, husband says, wife says, partner says, partner says. And then I annotate it to say, this is what you're accomplishing, because what we haven't been able to get to today is the actual way of framing things so that you can empty somebody out, that you know how to do this. This is a skill. Emotional communication is a skill. And if any skill requires two things. One, a coach, which is what I've been doing. And two is practice. You got to learn how to react this way and know your own stuff that's being tapped into so you don't regress back to old ways of dealing with things, basically. And so that's the process. That's what makes it. Well, for me, what I enjoy about it is that it's creative. No two people are the same. Their backgrounds aren't the same, and so it's a creative process. It's not like saying, okay, here's the formula, here's the recipe. No, everybody's different, and we have to adapt to their previous experiences, their history level experiences, their history with each other, for instance, and how do we change our lifestyle so that we can be a soothing presence in our own well-being and have a balanced life, as this. Because you can't have a balanced life with all these relationships going in 7 different directions.
Yeah, indeed. Perfect. I would include the links in the show notes for you also. You could easily find multiple ways to reach out to Dr. David. And folks, with that, today's episode does come to an end. And I just want you to sit with this thought for a few minutes as we wrap off that. When you talk about a balanced mind, it isn't just built inside you, or it is not something that you get by default, right? Really through relationships that you practice, the environments that you choose, and the repairs that you're willing to pursue. So just sit with that thought for a few minutes, perhaps, as we are wrapping up this conversation. And with that, if today's episode did break something up for you, maybe take a small next step today. Notice which relationships expand you and which ones actually somewhat tighten your chest. That data, I think, really, really matters. And with that, folks, this was Healthy Mind, Healthy Life. My name is Sayan, and we'll be back with another human conversation soon. Until next time, do take care of yourself and be honest about what your environment is really teaching you or your nervous system.